Welcome. My name is Alex Colvin. I'm the Dean of Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. The ILR School is very pleased to be hosting today's webinar. I want to start off by thanking my colleagues at ILR's Worker Institute, our tech staff, and especially Professor Desiree Leclerc for organizing today's event. The intersection of labor and trade is a tremendously important issue to workers across our nation and around the world whose livelihood and working conditions depends on their job opportunities and quality. It's also important to U.S. businesses, which depend on trade rules and predictable investment environments for making critical workplace decisions. For public policy, issues of trade and labor are inextricably linked as we seek to ensure that all workers participate in the benefits trade can bring and ensure that our trade agreements embody our values of human and labor rights, as well as setting a fair playing field that does not allow productive commerce and interchange to be subverted by competition on the basis of exploitation. For the ILR School, as the nation's leading academic institution studying issues of work, labor, and employment, issues in trade and labor are central to the work that we do. Our faculty have a long history of work in this area. I think of the work of my colleague Lance Comp, who joined us after being Director of Labor Law and Economic Research at the NAFTA Labor Secretariat, who has written many insightful analyses on the intersection of trade agreements and labor law and worker rights. Think of our Kate Bronfenbrenner's research on plant closings under NAFTA, and more recently of our own Desiree Leclerc's important recent work challenging us to think about the inclusion of gender rights and other important human rights in trade agreements. Through ILR's outreach programs, such as the Worker Institute and the Buffalo CoLab, the ILR School works closely with worker groups and with policymakers to ensure that workers' perspectives are reflected in U.S. policy, including labor, trade, and beyond. We also provide a critical platform for vulnerable, underrepresented workers, including workers with disabilities, LGBTQ workers, workers in the informal sector, documented and undocumented, and other worker communities whose voices may otherwise be left out of policy discussions. Today, it's an honor and pleasure to have with us the United States Trade Representative, Ambassador Catherine Tay, at today's webinar. As a member of President Biden's cabinet and the leader of the Office of the United States Trade Representative, Ambassador Tai is the principal trade advisor, negotiator, and spokesperson on U.S. trade policy. She's a long and distinguished career in public service. When the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, the successor to NAFTA, was negotiated, Ambassador Tai was serving as Chief Trade Counsel representing congressional Democrats at the House Ways and Means Committee. She played a key role in working with labor groups when negotiating the agreement. And her attention to the impact of trade on overlooked and vulnerable workers is a vital call for all of us to think about the full breadth of the impact of trade on the American workforce and how to make it benefit all. Ambassador Tai, thank you for agreeing to meet with us today to discuss U.S. trade policy and its effects on vulnerable workers. We appreciate your willingness to listen and to engage on these critical issues. Ambassador Tai, we look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Dean Colvin, for that very warm welcome. And I want to begin by thanking the ILR School for inviting me to join this very important webinar. I'm looking forward to learning more about the work and research happening across the ILR School and the Worker Institute. And I believe there is real synergy between your work and what we are doing here at USTR. But I want to begin with President Biden's terrific State of the Union address last night. It was a soaring speech, but one line in particular resonated with me, and it is really connected to our conversation today. The president said, "When we invest in our workers, when we build our economy from the bottom up and the middle out, we can do something we haven't done in a long time, build a better America." And we are well on our way. Over the last year, we have experienced historic economic growth. We created more than 6.5 million new jobs since the start of our administration. Unemployment is down, wages are up, but President Biden knows that there is more work to do. And in order to build a truly equitable and fair economy, he knows we need to invest in our workers. As many of you know, the Biden-Harris administration is rethinking the role of trade policy in the 21st century, so that the benefits of trade are more widely shared with workers and communities across the country. As part of this new approach, we have been re-examining who is at the table when we develop policy so that more perspectives and lived experiences are represented and incorporated. This is a core component of our worker-centered trade policy. And over the last year, we have reached a number of historic accomplishments and victories on behalf of American workers, farmers, and businesses. We are defending the rights of workers at home and abroad to raise labor standards and avoid that race to the bottom in trade. We are supporting the long-term viability of key domestic sectors like our steel, aluminum, and aerospace industries, including the millions of Americans employed in those sectors. These have been significant efforts, but beyond these efforts, we want to examine how our policies can generate long-term, equitable economic prosperity that is widely shared. This includes for communities that have been underserved and historically overlooked. And this is why I asked the US International Trade Commission to examine the distributional impacts of trade on workers by skill level, income, gender, race and ethnicity, age, ability, orientation, and location. In short, we need better and more comprehensive data to inform and support our policies. I know that of all audiences, this one certainly appreciates the power and importance of data. We intend to use the USITC's final report as a roadmap to make our trade policy more targeted and effective. It will be a pillar in our worker-centered trade policy, and I'm confident that future administrations and US trade representatives will benefit. But we still have a while before the Commission will publish its report, which is why I want to take a step back and explain what will happen over the next several months. Through April 1, the USITC will hold 7 roundtables, including 2 in-person sessions that will take place in Fresno, California, and Detroit, Michigan. These will be followed by an academic symposium on April 5 and 6, and a public hearing on April 19. The USITC will also accept public comments until May 17. Together, these events and discussions will be opportunities for the Commission to hear from experts, academics, and any interested individuals to present research that is relevant to the broader investigation. My office is closely watching these forums, and we are eager to hear what the public has to say. I hope many of you will take this opportunity to engage and use your extensive knowledge and research to help inform the Commission's work. I hope you will continue to help us implement our worker-centered trade policy in other ways. Our agenda requires constant engagement with a wide range of stakeholders, including the ILR School, the Worker Institute, and all of you. The values of this policy will be embedded throughout our work moving forward, including our Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, our enforcement of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, our work to promote racial and gender equity in trade. Your input and suggestions on the USITC study and all of this work will be invaluable as we continue to defend the rights of workers and deliver economic prosperity to real people and their communities. With that, I look forward to hearing more about your research and answering some of your questions. Thank you.
Ambassador Tai, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to discuss these important and critical issues with us. Hello, everyone. My name is Desiree Leclerc, and I teach international labor law at the ILR School and will be moderating today's webinar. I'd like to first take a quick second to acknowledge the hard work carried out by the ILR School Tech and Marketing departments, to our panelists, without all of whom this event would not have been possible. I'd also like to thank the hundreds of registered attendants for joining us today. Ambassador Tai, it is clear from your efforts and from last night's State of the Union that there's a renewed energy behind strengthening labor rights, both through national labor laws and our trade policy. We at the ILR School were delighted to see your commission study to the ITC. And as you'll hear today, we have 2 teams working to inform that study. We anticipate submitting our results to the ITC in early April. Our preliminary takeaway, viewed broadly, is that the one-size-fits-all approach under our current labor provisions template is insufficient to protect all workers in all sectors in the United States. Tackling these issues will take creativity, conversations, and experimentation. But if there was ever a team of extraordinarily hardworking and competent women and men capable of taking on that challenge, Ambassador Tai. It's the folks in your labor and econ offices. We at the ILR School look forward to seeing what you and your team accomplish. Now, without further ado, let's proceed. Our agenda today is as follows. The panelists will each briefly reflect on their experiences working with marginalized communities and our contributions to the ITC study, and will pose questions to the ambassador. After each intervention, we will give the ambassador the opportunity to address those questions before going on to the next speaker. Following this discussion, the Cornell team will take questions from the audience, beginning with the updates we've received on gender rights activities carried out so far with Mexico under USMCA. Our first speaker today is Dr. Patricio Campos Medina, the Executive Director of the ILR's Workers Institute, where she leads a team focusing on research, policy innovation, and training to advance worker justice and collective bargaining rights. Prior to joining the ILR School, Dr. Campos Medina worked for several US unions representing low-wage workers. She previously served as a labor staff representative for the USTR Labor Advisory Committee on Trade, and in 2008, she was appointed to serve on President Obama's USTR transition team. Dr. Campos Medina, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor Leclerc, for your introduction and for organizing this critical panel. As you share, my background on issues of trade and American workers come from both my personal experience as the daughter of low-wage immigrant workers, and after working for more than 15 years representing the interests of American workers in the manufacturing warehousing industry in the United States. I commend U.S. Ambassador Tai for attempting to expand the analysis of the distributional impact of trade on workers of color and other non-traditional communities, which include low-wage and undocumented workers. Recent empirical literature demonstrates a willingness to begin a real discussion on the merit of the assumption that the trade-off of unregulated free trade is mostly a positive one for consumers and workers in advanced economies. Therefore, it is incumbent on us as academics to more convincingly argue and estimate the very impacts of trade for excluded communities of color, so that, as stated recently by author Dorn and Hansen, quote, "The case for advancing a regulated free trade is not based only on theory alone, but on a foundation of evidence that illuminates who gains, who loses, by how much, and under what conditions," end quote. We at the Worker Institute conduct research and policy innovation that advances the rights of workers to have a collective bargaining agreement and to build power for those outside of the formal labor relations system in the United States. Those include workers in the gig and precarious economy, low-wage workers in critical essential sectors such as the logistics and warehouse industry, light manufacturing, and in the service economy that sustains our global economy. Precarious work and work in the gig economy is not new. What is new is the lack of access to a social safety net for American workers and the lack of benefits while employed. This precariousness is even worse for immigrant workers of color who lack formal immigration status and therefore are considered undocumented. They are displaced from the place of birth for many reasons, but for workers in our region, for example, Central America and Mexico and the Caribbean, many of them are displaced for economic reasons and moved across borders looking for employment. They come to the United States and they, as undocumented workers, and enter our markets. And they get employed through what we call nowadays a tertiary system of employment, which as temporary workers in our supply chains, like the warehousing, the logistics industry, and take on low-wage jobs in the communities that have been impacted by changes in the manufacturing economy. In response to this precarity, worker justice centers, community organizations have stepped up new mechanisms for organizing and representing these workers. Our greatest migration comes from our closest trading partners, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And despite the need for that labor, And despite the need for a growing economy of younger workers, we still don't have a formal process for regulating the employment needs of this population. The ongoing question that remains for many of workers in the undocumented community or in the law wage industry is this. If US capital has the right to move across borders and is protected by international financial laws, what are the possibilities for US trade policy and for the United States government to recognize the rights of workers to move freely across the borders of our closest trading region, Mexico, Central America? We know that on the WTO rules, capital owned by global corporations has the right to move and is protected. Yes, the migrants from those same countries, however, have no rights of movement across borders. These workers come to the United States and are fully employed in our supply chain, in our import and export sectors, and they are critical and are essential to a healthy economy. Given the nativists or the negative perception of the impact of undocumented migration in our economy, and the sense in some sectors of our communities that blame immigrants for unfair competition and low wage work, what role can trade play in driving a discussion on the complementary role that an orderly employment-based pathway for people in the region to come in and out to work and go back to visit their families has in establishing sustainable economic development for the region? I had two specific questions for Ambassador Tai, and that I would like to hear about how the administration is trying to address the concerns of these immigrant workers who are here in the United States and are fully employed. The first question is, how can the Biden administration trade policy change to make sure it recognizes the right of people to move across borders to find dignified work? And number two, how can the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative support workers' ability to hold corporations accountable to their labor rights commitments contained in U.S. trade agreements, both in their home countries and in the United States? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for your very thoughtful questions. Let me take up your first question that relates to the movement of workers across borders. I think that the more you work in some of these individual policy areas, the more you realize that none of our policy areas in terms of our policy disciplines exist in a vacuum. With respect to the forces around trade, you are talking about the movement of goods, certainly also the movement of services, and that necessarily also implies the movement of people. So I appreciate you raising this question around the impacts of our trade policies on the flow of capital and also the flow of human capital, if you will. It's a bit complicated because I'll just confess to you that in terms of my jurisdiction and competency, it is really about, the trade policy discipline as it's evolved, which relates to the goods and the services. The other pieces are implied and are outside of my area of authority, moves over into immigration policy. That's just the way our policies are organized. But I want to get at the core of your question, which is the intersection, as Dean Colvin raised at the beginning, of trade and labor. Let me first start with an observation about US labor law, which is that it applies regardless of immigration status, provides protections for those who have crossed our borders to work here in the United States. Let me also share an observation. Several of our free trade agreements have provisions that address cooperating with our trade partners on issues related to migrant workers' rights. The agreement, I think, that represents the furthest evolution of these provisions would be the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which has that provision that notes the vulnerability of migrant workers, whether nationals or non-nationals, and requires that they be protected under each party's labor laws. I think this is my long way of saying that with your question in particular, we don't actually have a lot of tools right now through trade policy. Nevertheless, I want to acknowledge the relevance and the importance of the question that you are raising, and the fact that we care very much about the impacts of our trade policies on ordinary people, on workers, and this idea of solidarity applies also to workers who have moved across borders, not just workers, who are static on differing sides of a border. Let me move on to make sure that I answer your second question also, which relates to the role of corporate actors in the relationship between trade and labor. And on this one, we'll make a couple observations here too, which is that as our trade policies advance, as the world economy evolves, we are increasingly appreciating the nuances in how trade translates into the real world effects, the effects on real people that defy some of the basic simplified economic theories of comparative advantage, Econ 101 kinds of models for how trade works. Our trade agreements and our trade conversation often will congregate around a kind of a macro conversation around trade flows, the numbers associated with imports and exports. We'll break things down into sectors. We might even lump, workers as a concept into one category of stakeholders that we're thinking about, and an aspect of our economy. But the fact of the matter is that trade policies get translated into reality through the actions and decisions of individuals, individual entities, all of the different component parts of our economy. And I think that we are increasingly expanding the conversation in our trade policy to examining the roles of the different components of our economy in trade. So our focus on workers, but also increasingly bringing to bear an attention on the responsibilities of corporate actors in our economic ecosystem and translating our trade policies into actual economic effects. On this one, I would say that most of our trade agreements have a mechanism for filing petitions on labor issues that allows for some connecting of the dots relating to how our labor commitments that are between states are translating into the experiences of workers. But I really want to highlight one aspect of the USMCA, which I think goes farther than any trade agreement that I know of in this area, which is the rapid response labor-specific enforcement mechanism, which really piggybacks on Mexico's own domestic labor justice reforms that allows for the participants in this trade agreement, the two states, to look at behaviors at the specific firm level, at specific facilities, and allow for a fact finding to take place that relates to whether or not the labor justice reforms in Mexico are being faithfully translated into practice. And I'll just flag under the USMCA in the first year of our administration, we've already started 2 petitions and 2 actions under this mechanism that have yielded exactly the kinds of results that we were hoping for, which is to bring the tools of this agreement to bear in reinforcing the rights of workers that have been promised by the parties to the agreement and are being tested in the economy at the corporate level.
Thank you for that, Ambassador Tai. A good reminder that in the first year of the new administration, this USTR has tripled the number of enforcement mechanisms or steps under our trade agreements to enforce labor rights. I'd like to now turn things over to Dr. Russell Weaver, a quantitative geographer and the Director of Research at the Cornell ILR Buffalo CoLab. Dr. Weaver's research programs are aimed at identifying and understanding context-sensitive, sustainable, and equitable community economic development, particularly in the post-industrial and Rust Belt regions of the United States. Dr. Weaver, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you, Ambassador, for giving us your time today. This is such a great opportunity for us. I'll jump right in and say that as someone who's affiliated with one of the ILR School's academic extension offices, part of our mission is Cornell's land grant mission, which is to improve the lives and communities of people throughout New York State. And so to that end, we do a lot of regional focused research. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, is taking this look at trade and its disparate impacts on the workforce and thinking about how it might play out in the context of a single region. And so our unit in Buffalo was established in 1946. At that time, Buffalo was the nation's 15th largest city, largest inland port, and 8th leading manufacturer. Manufacturing brought considerable prosperity to the region. When Cornell did arrive on the scene in the 40s, one of the unit's core objectives was to ensure that workers received a fairer share of that prosperity. And often for us, that meant labor education and training, which proved critical to unionization efforts. And it helped Buffalo Niagara to become a leader among all regions in the US in union density. And of course, manufacturing is where that union density was the strongest in our region. Given the size of the sector, that meant that good paying union jobs were pretty plentiful. For instance, in 1970, manufacturing still accounted for about a third of all jobs in Buffalo Niagara and nearly 40% of total earnings, higher than any other industry. There were more than 170,000 people producing goods here in Western New York at average earnings that were higher in all but one other industry in the region. Those good paying jobs typically had relatively low educational requirements, which was especially important considering the systemic forces that prevent marginalized groups from accessing the same educational credentials or opportunities as their comparatively privileged counterparts. So in that way, manufacturing jobs were a path both to economic stability for working families and potentially to greater racial economic equality in the region. Black workers in Buffalo Niagara were roughly 1.5 times as likely as white workers to work in manufacturing in these high-paying unionized jobs. Racial economic inequality was still the norm, with about 24% of Black families living in poverty compared to just 5.5% of white families. But given that disproportionately high rate at which Black workers worked in manufacturing, the racial income gap had a chance to start closing. Instead, the 80s came around and brought an approach to trade policy that really dropped the weight of public policy in the government on the same side as corporations, launching a lot of workers into economic precarity. Capital was incentivized to bail on union towns like Buffalo and set up shop in right-to-work states, or more often nations with cheap labor costs and no environmental and safety standards. In Buffalo, those practices decimated the region and shocked the economy. The metro area's population shrank by more than 200,000 people between 1970 and today, and the city's population was cut in half relative to its peak. With such a large contraction, many jobs simply vanished without replacement. And the industries that have emerged now as successors to manufacturing haven't created the same comparatively broad-based access to high-paying union jobs. Today, the dominant industries here are the so-called eds and meds industries, where high-paying jobs have much higher costs of entry and are therefore less accessible, and retail trade and food and accommodation services, where jobs are precarious, wages are low, and unionization efforts are routinely squashed. Manufacturing now accounts for less than 9% of jobs in the region. Now, troublingly, workers of color are underrepresented in the region's high-paying knowledge sector jobs and overrepresented in those low-wage service jobs. Contrary to promises that increased capital mobility brings progress, the gap in the poverty rate between Black and white families that I referred to in 1970 is worse today than it was then. These disparate impacts aren't limited to race either. Women account for disproportionate shares of workers in the prominent eds and meds industries, but they're more likely than men to occupy lower paying jobs. And when they have the same jobs as men, they're more likely to earn less. Two of the top sub-industries for workers with disabilities in Buffalo, Niagara are supermarkets and general merchandising stores or supercenters like Walmart. The same policy framework that allows manufacturing plants to leave the US in search for lower labor costs and higher profits enable retail giants like Walmart to sell large volumes of cheaply produced imported goods at low prices, while paying workers sub-living wages, offering few if any benefits, and doling out the hoarded profits to executives and wealthy shareholders. In our ongoing analysis, we found that persons with disabilities who work in these types of establishments earned a median wage of just $10.38 per hour between 2015 and 2019. During that same interval, Walmart averaged $124.5 billion per year in gross profits. So in sum, trade policy to date and our nation's overarching policy framework has bled regions like Buffalo of secure, high-paying production jobs that were broadly available, leaving behind a bifurcated service economy that locks in and reinforces pre-existing structurally generated patterns of inequality. Now, earlier I mentioned that Cornell and Buffalo were engaged in labor education and training, and we've done that for much of our 76-year history. While those elements are still integral to our mission, more recently we've been shifting toward research and action aimed at advancing racial, social, and economic justice in Western New York, with the goal of making Greater Buffalo a national model for equitable community development and a more democratic economy. In 2007, our office incubated a community-based think tank and central node in a network of more than 300 grassroots partners and labor organizations. That network's become something of a laboratory in which innovative, locally adaptive solutions can be found to systemic problems by centering local knowledge and lived experience and supplementing that knowledge with rigorous research, analysis, and policy development. Moving forward, our team here hopes to leverage this dynamic and growing network, as well as our 76 years worth of relationship building here, to construct a nuanced understanding of how workers, especially underrepresented workers, perceive trade and its impacts on their lives. As we launch deeper into this project, we're already hearing two overriding questions or concerns that do parallel our office's trajectories both before and after deindustrialization. So first, as I already noted, so many Buffalonians lost their jobs because their work was offshored to low-wage countries. In some cases, such as the DuPont plant here, union members were sent over to China to train workers on how to take their jobs, and they were terminated from the company when they returned. So a lot of workers like that are asking, what are the administration's plans for negotiating or renegotiating trade agreements that will allow US-based workers, especially in manufacturing, to compete in the international marketplace? And second, recognizing that ordinary workers possess vast knowledge about how different systems and policies affect them, what are your office's plans for, I know you've mentioned many times that you have a worker-centered approach to trade policy, so what are your plans for including more worker voices in those policies and in the planning process? Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for your presentation. This is the reason why I love researchers and data, because you can paint a picture of reality that we might guess at or feel instinctively, but you can't really have an intelligent policymaking process. You can't have an intelligent negotiation without basing your conversation on an understanding of what the facts are. So I'm absolutely delighted by all the facts and figures that you've provided to fill in the color and the shapes and sizes of the landscape that I know to be true in terms of the experience of our trade policies on communities like Buffalo and Western New York. So thank you so much for sharing that. To your first question, I have also read about and heard a lot of these stories of, in particular, manufacturing workers who have to go through essentially the indignity, right? Sort of the salt on top of the wound of training up the workers that are going to replace them in lower cost jurisdictions, and essentially handing off their livelihoods because we have allowed ourselves to erode our competitiveness, and it's led to a real erosion in particular our manufacturing base. The way you presented your question, though, and you posed your question, which is how can we renegotiate existing trade agreements, or how can we take a different approach to our trade agreements to essentially, I think the way you put it was to allow our workers, especially in manufacturing, to compete internationally, because that is what they want to do. And on this one, I've got two thoughts for you. The first thought is a little bit challenging the premise of your question, which is that I don't think that that is something that we can accomplish just through trade policy or just through the negotiation of trade agreements. Nevertheless, I think that our trade policies do matter here. They need to be coordinated with other policies. And I'll just return to aspects of President Biden's State of the Union speech last night, where you heard the intentionality around his commitment to reinvigorate the American manufacturing base in particular. And I think that it is going to have to be a partnership between trade policy and a lot of our other policies to correct for the forces that this version of globalization have created in our world economy and for the U.S. economy. So we very much feel that we have to take an approach to our trade negotiations with this goal in mind. But that it isn't about bringing everything home. It is nevertheless about creating creating a new version of globalization that can reinforce the creation of high standards when it comes to how we treat our workers and also how we treat our planet. And if there's a way that we can join forces with our trading partners to create systems that reinforce what we call the race to the top, then I think that we have within reach a version of globalization that will make workers in economies like the United States more competitive. So that is something that is very much on our minds, and I appreciate that question that you've posed. In terms of incorporating more workers' perspectives into our work, you've gotten at our advisory committee structure and how we welcome more worker perspectives. You know, there are a number of different things that we are trying to do here. One, of course, is to expand out the ranks of the workers and worker organizations who participate in this formalized statutory advisory structure. But I want to say that we're also approaching this in two other ways too. There is, you know, not just looking for more worker side perspectives, but also more diverse perspectives. Just thinking about the people who are coming to the conversation, whether they are representing worker organizations or industry organizations or environmental or other civil society perspectives. Having better representation just across the board, I think, makes the conversation more rich and necessarily makes our approach more multifaceted. The other area where we are working is to expand the conversation itself. That none of these things on their own is going to make a difference, but all of these aspects together. And with respect to the conversation, you know, when you talk about the way our trade policies, our economic policies have functioned, I think that a lot of our big companies, our big economic stakeholders, tend to think about workers as costs. Costs that you have to minimize, right? I think there is a particular opportunity we have right now where we are in terms of the disruptions that have been created and exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. The tightness of the labor market, I think, is changing some of the conversations so that even those traditional companies who are part of our stakeholder group increasingly, I think, are responsive to our invitation to engage with us on trade policy through the lens of seeing themselves as employers, through the lens of thinking of their workforces as assets that they have to groom and they have to retain, and not just as liabilities that they have to minimize. So there are a lot of different ways that we are approaching this, and I think you're absolutely right. How successful we are here is going to determine how successful we are overall.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai, for those informative responses and reactions. And, you know, one of the tensions that exists here that nobody's really talked about yet is the position still that it puts USTR in, right? The more you open your social dialogue and the more that you bring in counter views, the harder it becomes to have the flexibility and authority to negotiate the trade agreement that you've been asked to negotiate. So that, like, once again, cannot be an easy job. I'd like to turn now to Professor Chantal Thomas, the Radis Family Professor of Law and Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the Cornell Law School, where she teaches, researches, and writes in international economic law and inequality. Professor Thomas serves on the U.S. State Department's Advisory Committee on International Law and has been appointed to USMCA's roster of experts. She also advised the House Ways and Means Committee on matters of trade, inclusion, and equity during President Biden's transition. Professor Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Desiree, Dean Colvin, and the ILR School for organizing and hosting this event. And thank you so much, Ambassador Tai, for spending this time with us today. It's so greatly appreciated. I have just a few moments, and I think we're running up to the end of time, so I'm going to try to abbreviate my comments. I wanted to spend a little more time reflecting on the question of the distributional effects of trade policy for racial minority groups and intersectionality with other historically marginalized groups, and hopefully pose a couple of questions, Ambassador Tai, for discussion along those lines. So we know that trade liberalization did not only exacerbate inequalities forged in the distant past, but instead early racialized inequalities have often widened over time, not through inertia only, but also through concerted public policies and private actions in successive periods. And I will skip over a sort of presentation of those various dynamics, but in such a context, the economic vulnerability of racially other communities became predictably exacerbated by the effects of globalization on their jobs. And we heard a very clear example of that in Rusty's presentation earlier. This was not inevitable. A better social policy for supporting communities adversely affected by trade, coupled with broader social policies aimed at increasing economic stability within those communities, could have led to different outcomes, but a lack of inquiry into the interaction between structural inequality and trade liberalization, the historical legacies of racialized governance, and ideological adversity to redistributive social policy have all blocked progress along that alternate path. In his State of the Union speech yesterday, as you noted, Ambassador Tai, President Biden pointed out that the economic model of the last 40 years has given short shrift to distributional concerns in general. And in line with that statement, we need a new trade model that can understand the effect of trade, not only through its aggregate, but also through its distributive impact, not only sectorally, but also according to other social categories like class, race, gender, national origin, sexual orientation, disability, and so on. Without that information, US trade policymakers must make determinations about workers and the impact of trade on workers without a full understanding. So this is the work that Desiree and I, the other teams here, along with our researchers, are working on in support of the broader initiative that your office has spearheaded in gathering better information on and insight into the distributional effects of trade. So my questions for you, and they're broad and difficult questions in the quickly vanishing time that we have left, is the first would be that pending the outcome of this requested study of distributional effects, does the USTR yet have a sense of how trade policy might be adjusted to reflect the interests and needs of these varied and intersecting communities, not only workers belonging to historically marginalized racial groups, but also workers of non-US national origin, linguistic minorities, Indigenous persons, women workers, workers from the LGBT communities, with workers with disabilities, and so on. In other words, what would or could a trade policy more oriented toward the wide spectrum of equity and inclusion issues look like? Or what's your thinking on that at this moment in time? And then the follow-on question would be that in this time of unfortunately polarized politics, there's been much discussion of a growing divide potentially between the self-identified interests of white working class workers and those of historically marginalized racial minorities and other groups. And so can you discuss how the Biden administration envisions uniting those interests and needs, and how you would identify the connection that unites workers across these categories? Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal. And I will try to be brief to respect the time, but I also really want to get at these questions. I am such a fan of your work and the rigor and the scrutiny that you have been applying to this area for decades now. It just very, very pleased to be able to have all of you be a part of this conversation. I will say that when you are trying to do something new, it is hard. It is really, it is a lot harder than just applying what you've done before, and even applying things that you've done before and just modifying them a little bit. So we are trying to create kind of a quantum leap in terms of the way that we approach our trade policies. Let me start with your second question, I think. Let me see if I want to do that. Yes. And that is, you're right. I think that today it feels like I've been saying this for a year now, and it just feels more and more true that our entire world feels much more fragile today than any time that I've experienced in my lifetime. And I'm a child of the 1970s. So I've been around long enough. I know that, this world has gone through a lot. We're very resilient, but this is a really fragile version of the world that we are experiencing for the time I've been on this planet. To your point about polarization, fracturing, I guess what I would say is we're approaching this exercise to understand better where the promise of this globalization effort and this trade liberalization effort has not been fulfilled. When you go back, I've talked about this quite a few times, you go back to look at the preambular language in the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the World Trade Organization. I actually have no quibble at all with what the organization was set up to do, which was to raise living standards and to enable and reinforce the sustainability of our planet, to really expand the pie. It was this idea of rising tides lift all boats. One of the real awkwardnesses is over time the tide has definitely risen. The pie has gotten bigger, but we know in our core that the distribution of that pie, that the boats have not all satisfied this promise, and so that's why these exercises in terms of gathering the data, asking the questions is so important, so that we can figure out how to make the promise of trade and globalization actually deliver. So on this one, I guess what I would say is whether we're talking about, the white working class communities in the United States, communities of color, we actually, I think we lose sight of this. The thing that binds us together is our common humanity. Everyone has parents, lots of people have kids, everyone is somehow a member of a community. We all want something more for the next generation than we ourselves have gotten. We all want more for ourselves tomorrow than we have today. And I think that this entire exercise is to make sure that the amount of effort that we put into negotiating trade agreements, into traveling the world, doing the things that USTR does, that they actually have the impacts that we all want them to have. So that was to your second question. To your first one, I'll also try to just cut to the chase on this one, which is what can revised trade policies look like? It would be really, really honest with you. Also, for the interests of time, I don't know. But it does take a certain amount of courage, which we have in spades here at USTR, to embrace that I don't know, and to say, but I trust that by asking different questions, by building additional relationships, that we can create something that looks different and we're not afraid of it. And so at this stage in our work, that's my answer to you. And I hope that as we continue this conversation, we will build out what these new trade policies look like together.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those comments. It really is, I think, striking when we think about something you said earlier on about the trade conversation, right? That this is it's an ongoing conversation. I think we know that trade has these multiplicitous impacts across our economy, across our society. And the trick in coming up with a set of trade policies that really benefits the country broadly is to understand that there are these kind of intersections between different areas and how it's impacted. I was really struck by Rusty's comment about the disproportionate employment and manufacturing of Black workers in the Buffalo area, and as a result, being a group that's being disproportionately impacted by deunionization and also by trade displacement of some manufacturing there, which I think goes against some of the standards, I think stereotypes we often have about who's impacted by trade and where we need to focus efforts to remediate. So I think again it goes to this idea that we have to look at the data. We have to gather the data. We have to look at the data. We have to see who's being affected positively and negatively. We still have this idea that trade produces net gains for the nation. That's why we engage in it. But we have to realize there's these distributional aspects, and we have to know from the data where it's falling if we're gonna adjust our approaches to it. I do want to take a moment to also extend an invitation. We've been starting a conversation here today. We'd love to continue that conversation with you. I'd like to extend an open invitation for you to visit with our New York City Worker Institute, to come here to campus in Ithaca and talk to our students who I know would love to have a dialogue with you, and then also come up to Buffalo to engage in the conversation there. Obviously a very important one for the community there. So our doors are open to you, and we'd love to have more of your time, which you've so generously given to us. Let me turn it over to you for some last closing remarks from you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Colvin, and I would love to continue this conversation. Come visit you. Come to Ithaca and Buffalo anytime in the spring, summer, or fall.
Very strategic.
This has really been a delight, and I'll just say, when you are trying to do something new, you really treasure when you find the people who have been asking the questions that you are asking now, and who have the tools to make the conversation smarter, and to help shape what you're trying to create. I think that the ILR School, the Worker Institute, you have assets and resources that are critical to what we are trying to do. And I cannot wait to do more with all of you.
Great. Thank you very much. Desiree?
Thanks. We had hoped to do an audience Q&A. I don't know that we'll have time. Before we lose the ambassador, though, I do just want to say thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts for your time. And also, most importantly, if you come to ILR school, my international labor law students call dibs first. And then, of course, whoever else can fit into the room. But really, we can't wait to talk to you, and we really look forward to that. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you all for joining us. And at the ILR School, we look forward to hearing all of your comments, all of your inputs. Feel free, please, to reach out to us as we undertake some of these studies. Thank you all for your time. Have a wonderful day.